Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Handy Quilter, designed by a quilter for quilters. Sulky, express yourself with Sulky and create with confidence. Brother, it's so easy with Brother at your side. And Quilt Cut, easy fabric cutting for quilters.
Hi and welcome to Quilters Newsletter TV, a Quilters community. We're at the Houston International Quilt Market, and we're with Susan Cleveland, author, teacher, quilter, and Susan is going to talk to us today about precision piecing. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here. When I started quilting, I started off with piecing because I was familiar with my sewing machine, and a lot of times that's what we think quilts are. We picture a pieced quilt. So that's where a lot of beginners start. But I struggled because I would cut my pieces and they wouldn't fit together. So I really enjoy, now that I'm a teacher and author and doing all of that stuff, I enjoy finding ways to make difficult tasks easier for quilters. So I got some tips that I can share with you, okay?
And we are ready to hear ways to make it better.
Oh, good. Oh, I've got oodles of them. Now, this little piece has lots of small pieces.
It does.
Very tricky piecing here. Skinny little pieced border. I do love a skinny pieced border. But for these pieces to fit together, we need to stitch accurately.
Right.
And so there are a bunch of tips, but I want to share with you my two biggest ones.
Okay.
All right. I brought today my imaginary sewing machine. Okay, and I'm hoping that the viewers can see that the needle is in the center needle position on my imaginary machine. Now, if we piece a 1/4 inch seam allowance with the needle in the center, on some machines the fabric isn't touching the right feed dog at all. On other machines the fabric is just barely touching the right feed dog. But what this is like is driving with the right wheels in the mud.
Right.
The machine can't feed the strips through nice and straight without taking advantage of all of the feed dogs.
Okay.
So my first big idea is to move this needle over to the right. Now, when I piece a 1/4 inch seam allowance, my fabric is going to totally cover all the feed dogs.
Okay.
So it's going to feed through much straighter with much less effort on my part.
Right.
So that's one really big idea. Now, another big idea is how big should the seam allowance be? Well, I've got a little tool, and on this tool, it's used to help set up the sewing machine. There are 3 different seam allowances available. And the thing to understand is one seam allowance does not fit all.
Okay.
There's a little fabric taken in the turn of the cloth where the fabric doubles back on itself. So different thicknesses of fabric, different thicknesses of thread demand a different seam allowance. So I have people first set up in hole B. So we take that needle, it's already moved over to the right, and we set it up in hole B like this. And then we take whatever you like for a seam guide and place it beside that tool. And now to sew, you'll set the tool aside, use that needle over there to the right. Now see, my fabric will ride right beside the seam guide and it will cover all the feed dogs, and the fabric feeds through much straighter, much less effort. Well, you might wonder about the different holes on here. After you do a test, then you will measure the result. If the result is correct, woo, yippee skippy, you stick with hole B for that fabric and thread. But if it's not okay, then you might be better off with hole A or hole C, slightly different seam allowance.
Okay.
So that's how that works.
Okay.
Those are 2 really big ideas that can really impact our piecing. You know, when we need to pin, and we're going to get real tight in here. When, let's say I'm going to make a little 4 patch.
Okay.
Okay? And the same idea goes for even a more complicated patchwork. But these 2 pieces are going together. Opposing seams is a good idea. So you'll see that this seam allowance is pressed in one direction, and this seam allowance is pressed in the other direction, so that they nest together when we put them together here, like this. Well, most quilters would take and pin through the whole business, and it makes a big, wad, and it disrupts our sewing machine when we sew up to it, and it doesn't hold these pieces together quite as tightly as we'd like. So I nest these together and feel them with my fingers to make sure they're tightly nested together.
Right.
And then instead of pinning through all those layers, I do the pin tuck trick. So I take and I tuck this pin under the seam allowance and I tuck it all the way up to that stitching line. And then I go down and come up wherever. And it's much flatter right here where we're sewing.
Right.
Because it's pinning through where it's actually important, near where that quarter-inch seam is going to come across here. So we can sew right up to that pin, then pull the pin and keep sewing.
Right.
And that big bulge doesn't make for a cockeyed stitch.
Awesome.
So that's a big tip that can be helpful too. And I find if I nest those together and feel it with my fingers, I'm much more accurate than if I'm poking a pin through. I tend to knock things out of alignment.
Okay, so what else?
Ooh, chain piecing. You know, we quilters, we love to chain piece. If we think a little bit about how the sewing machine works and understand that, we can increase our precision with the chain piecing.
Okay.
So, you know, when the needle is going up and down, the feed dogs are going up and down as well. When the needle is down, the feed dogs are down and out of the way. So when I chain piece, I put one set through and I stop with the needle down. The feed dogs are out of the way. And you know, that needle is just in the air, it's not in fabric. Then I take my next set and put them right up to the needle. So I have to raise the foot, I put the next set right up to the needle, the feed dogs are out of the way.
Okay.
Then when I start to stitch, the feed dogs come up and push that right in to take the first stitch. Because it's a common problem when we put that next set in for the toe of the sewing machine foot to knock it out of alignment. Right? So if we chain piece, stop with our needle down in between the chaining, feed dogs are out of the way, raise the foot, put your next pieces right in. Now some sewing machines are so smart, you can set it up to stop with the needle down and raise the foot. So you don't have to do that yourself.
Exactly.
Exhausting, I know.
Yes. So I like that. That makes perfect sense.
Oh, good. You want a little bit more?
More?
A little more. I found this tool and I so wish I had invented it. It's called the whacker. And it is a mallet specifically designed for fabric.
Okay.
Wherever you have seam allowances that bunch together, they look bulgy. They not only look bulgy, but there's shadow there, and it's more difficult to quilt that area because when our foot gets rocking and rolling like this, it wants to skip stitches. So we'd like it to be real flat. This tool, you take and you press it normally, you give it 2 shots of steam, then you go whack, whack.
I love it.
And 1 more shot of steam, so flat, you can't believe it. So it not only makes the quilt look nicer and flatter, but also it's easier to quilt the quilt that way. So that's another tip.
Another one, yes. How about another one?
Also, let's back up the truck all the way to preparing the fabric.
Okay.
Now, some people want to pre-wash their fabric. That's great. When it comes out of the dryer, I like to steam it and starch it. Now, I only starch what I think I'm going to use for that project.
Okay.
But fabric that has some starch on it, has some body to it, behaves so much better.
Yes, it does.
Not only when we're cutting it, but also when we're piecing and pressing. Just a little body to it. Now, some people don't like to pre-wash their fabrics. Well, then I steam that fabric and starch it. And what I'm finding is that with the heat and the moisture combination, it will pre-shrink that fabric. So I do suggest doing that so that you don't have any uneven shrinkage and surprises later. So that's how I like to prepare my fabric for accurate piecing.
Okay, great. Well, Susan, you've just had a lot of good ideas to share with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
I hope they're useful.
And we're glad you joined us too.
Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Handy Quilter, designed by a quilter for quilters. Sulky, express yourself with sulky and create with confidence. Brother, it's so easy with Brother at your side. And Quilt Cut, easy fabric cutting for quilters.